I'm Aaron Meyer, this week's producer, and this is the 19-9 Podcast. Today, the Chucker talks with Mike Waters. And like walking into the Carrier Dome for the first time, he opens our eyes to old Big East stories and even works in some travel advice if you're trying to get from Syracuse to Tallahassee.
And you remember the scene in the second Bad News Bears movie when Tanner Boyle takes the field at the Astrodome? That's kind of the way I walk out of the media workroom, out the tunnel for my first Syracuse game at the Dome, and I couldn't believe the size.
We also get him to nail down his all-time Syracuse starting five.
All right, all-time Cuse starting five.
And it's got to be guys I covered, so I can't put Roosevelt Bowie at center. Okay. This is really bad because there's going to be some guys mad at me, and
It's time to start the show.
Isn't it amazing when Michigan can keep this game to a 19-foot 9-inch game inside that three-point line? It's all there. Nice move by Steve Fisher here.
All right, welcome to the 19-9 Podcast. I'm the Chucker, 19-9's resident historian, and it's time to talk Syracuse hoops today with a man who knows the Orange basketball program as well as anyone outside of the Carrier Dome, and that's award-winning journalist Mike Waters. Mike's been covering Syracuse hoops for the last 3 decades at Syracuse.com and for the Post-Standard. He's a graduate of the University of North Carolina. He was there for the 4 Brad Daugherty years. How about that? He's also past president of the U.S. Basketball Writers Association. And is reference to Syracuse hoops, he's also the host of the popular Inside Syracuse Basketball podcast. Today, we're going to dive deep into the Cuse basketball history and Mike's mind. We're going to gather some insights on the heyday of Big East basketball, Syracuse's move into the ACC, and notable moments in Cuse's history before we challenge Mike to name his all-time Cuse starting five. All right, he's on the horn there. But Mike, thanks for joining us here on the 19-9 Podcast.
Hey, listen, thanks for having me on. I've been really looking forward to this.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we'll talk some hoops here today.
All right, well, that's always the plan. Cuse, one of the flagship programs, premier programs in the 19-9 lineup. So, before we get into discussing Syracuse hoops, Mike, and your time covering the program up there in central New York, get that more historical perspective, I want to start with the current season. We're recording this the morning of November 17th. The Cuse right now are 2-0. Their first big test comes up later this month against Indiana. They got soon after, they're going to face Villanova, former Big East foe, of course. They're picked to finish 7th in the 15-team ACC. Mike, what's your high-level forecast for the season squad? What do you see coming from Boeheim's Army there?
I think this team is flying a little bit under the radar right now after losing a lot of guys off of last year's team. A lot of guys left, via transfer. Quincy Guerrier went out to Oregon. So the starting center is still out from 2 years ago, Barama Sidibe. They played without him all of last year. He's out again right now with another knee injury. So, they are easily overlooked. And I think everyone's kind of sitting back and waiting to see what they do against some of these high-profile non-conference teams that they've got lined up here in the next coming weeks. I think they can do okay. They're going to struggle to rebound against bigger, more athletic teams. No doubt about that. It remains to be seen how well they're going to be able to play defense. And, coupled with that will be how well do they rebound on the defensive boards, because once they do force a team to miss, they can't let them get that second shot. So, those two go hand in hand. But this team has a lot of experience. Buddy Boeheim is a senior. Joe Girard's a junior. They brought in some transfers. Cole Swider from Villanova. He's a fourth-year player. Jimmy Boeheim is a fifth-year college player. Jesse Edwards stepping in at center is a junior. Doesn't have any starting experience coming into the year, but he's a junior. That's in this day and age of college sports, that is a very experienced lineup, and they can shoot. Buddy Boeheim, Joe Girard, Cole Swider are all really, really good shooters. When they're on, they're going to be a challenge for most teams, and I think it's going to be a real entertaining team because of that aspect.
Yeah, so it's we'll see, we'll know soon. They're gonna, like I said, they got Indiana coming up, they got Nova, so we're gonna know real soon and have a good feel of for what the Cuse we can expect from them here in the 2021-2022 season. So, well, Mike, let's kind of go back to the beginning. We always like to understand how someone got to their hoops origin story, so to speak. And you're a journalist, so we're gonna look at it from that angle. So talk about, when did you start covering Syracuse hoops, and how did a young journalist from North Carolina end up in Central New York covering the Orange?
Well, I wound up in Syracuse actually because of some freelance work I did when I was a student at North Carolina. I was covering a lot of lacrosse for the student newspaper there, the Daily Tar Heel. And I had a chance to do some stringing work for the Baltimore Sun. I covered a lot of lacrosse games for them over a couple of years, and got to know one assistant sports editor fairly well, because he was always the guy who would call me and say, we'd like to have you cover the North Carolina Towson State game on Saturday, or the North Carolina UMBC game on Wednesday. And so I got to know him. And after I graduated, I actually went to Nashville, Tennessee. And I was working at the afternoon paper there. It's no longer with us, but the Nashville Banner. And after working there for a couple years, I got a call from that assistant sports editor in Baltimore. His name was Steve Miller. And he said, how would you like to cover Syracuse basketball in the Big East Conference? And I said, that sounds real good to me. And he says, well, I used to work there, and I know the sports editor, and I've already told him about you. He said, get your clips in an envelope, get them in the mail, and get them up there. They're expecting to hear from you. So that's how I ended up moving to Syracuse in January of 1989 in the middle of a snowstorm.
What a great way to go to Syracuse, right?
Asking myself, what the hell have I done?
And also, when you arrive there, the Keith Smart shot is still in the collective memory of the Syracuse fans. So, Syracuse by that time, you look at their basketball history, and it's an independent for a lot of years. It's long ago history, and just kind of a middling program. And then it really starts to take off in the 70s. So by the time you get there, though, in 1989, Syracuse is pretty firmly in the nation's basketball consciousness. And that's really driven by, there's a Final Four run in 75. Obviously, the formation of the Big East that leads to national TV appearances. You got the arrival of Pearl Washington in 1983. I mentioned the 1987 championship game where Keith Smart hits the jumper to knock off Syracuse. But, Syracuse is on the national map. And so when you get called, I have to imagine that's one, pretty exciting. But as a UNC grad, and you said you worked for the paper there at the college, you saw one of the game's principal blue bloods up close. So when you come to Syracuse, Central New York, what are your initial impressions of the Syracuse program, and what kind of caught your attention?
Well, I can remember the first game I covered, a Syracuse game. It was I think it was against Notre Dame, or might have been Seton Hall. But anyway, I remember going into the Dome. And you remember the scene in the second Bad News Bears movie when Tanner Boyle takes the field at the Astrodome, and he runs out to shortstop, and he's kind of looking up, and he starts spinning around until he falls on his butt. That's kind of the way I walk out of the media workroom, out the tunnel, for my first Syracuse game at the Dome, and I couldn't believe the size of the place. They're playing in this huge football arena, a bubble dome, and at the College of, they're the only school doing it, and there's all these fans. I'd never seen so many people at a regular season college basketball game. Back in 1988, 89, 90, they were averaging 28,000 people a game. Because not every game was on TV back then. So if you wanted to get seats to all to the good games, you had to get season tickets. So it was just so big, so many people. It's just the size and the magnitude. And then, the interesting thing I came to find out pretty quickly after that is, I went to Carolina, and, I was born and raised pretty much in the South. So I know a lot of those large state universities like Tennessee, Kentucky, Carolina, the Alabamas, and, most of the fans are in that state, and they probably went to the state school because it's a good price bargain on the tuition there. So, but if they didn't go, their daughter went, or their dad did, or their cousin did. Everyone has a connection to Tennessee and Tennessee football in the state of Tennessee. Same with Carolina basketball, or if you're not the right color in the state of North Carolina, maybe you went to NC State and you wear red. Syracuse was completely different. It was a private school. A lot of its students come from way outside the area. They come from Boston or New York City or New Jersey, and they come here and they're here for 4 years and they leave. Most of the people at a Syracuse game are not Syracuse grads. They don't have anybody who ever went to Syracuse. They're from the area and they support the school. They're not. They might be from Syracuse, but they're also from Watertown, Binghamton, Utica, Rochester, and they come to these games in horrible weather. They drive through conditions that I didn't drive in when I was younger. Growing up in Maryland or Tennessee, they trudge up hills to get to the dome, and then they shed all their layers so that they can watch a basketball game for 2 hours. And that's always been really the most interesting dynamic to this whole Syracuse University fan base. Is it's not like a lot of other fan bases of the schools that we consider when we talk about the big basketball and football programs.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about how the city kind of adopts the region kind of adopts the Syracuse as their team, and I'm in Chicago, and I think back in the heyday of DePaul basketball in the 70s and into the 80s, unfortunately not as much recently, but 70s and the 80s, DePaul was Chicago's team. And so I can resonate with that. That resonates with me a lot. So when you get there to Syracuse, 1989, and then, you've been covering the program for 30 years, but I want to focus on just kind of those first couple years there. Because Big East basketball, you don't necessarily see what some people might consider the real heyday of Big East basketball in the mid 80s. Some people might say, the 90s were just as good, with Iverson and Kittles and et cetera. Give me a sense. How would you had this ACC basketball experience, right? Or some SEC basketball experience. How would you characterize Big East basketball in the 1990s?
It was the city game. It was the city, it was the city game when it started in the Northeast in the 80s, Dan Gavitt's brainchild, bringing in all these schools that were all sort of part of this conglomerate called the ECAC, but they were pretty much, especially the coaches at the big schools like the John Thompsons, Jim Boeheim's, they were free to do whatever they wanted. They scheduled whoever they wanted. And Dan Gavitt convinces them all, whether it's Seton Hall or St. John's or, Georgetown and Syracuse, to come together. And man, they just brought Northeast basketball together, and they gave all these kids from the Northeast a reason to stay in the Northeast. All the kids from New York City that were, escaping for years to go down to Carolina or NC State or Tennessee, Ernie and Bernie at Tennessee, back in the 70s.
You mentioned Kenny Smith earlier, New York kid goes down to North Carolina, right?
Yeah, and he wasn't the first in New York to go to Carolina either. And then, Bobby Cremins, was getting guys for Georgia Tech. But, it was these guys, and if they didn't know each other from high school or where they grew up, they knew somebody else on the team. There was a familiarity that, led to some rivalries. The fans saw each other every year. The team saw each other. And it was still that way when I got there. Syracuse still didn't like Georgetown. Georgetown didn't like Syracuse. Syracuse wasn't all that fond of St. John's, to be honest. It went back and forth. And Providence and Boston College, had their rivalry going on too. And Villanova and Pittsburgh had the Pennsylvania thing going. It was really an amazing league at the time when it was still, smaller, like 9 teams. So you played everybody twice. That bad blood would, start to bubble. When you saw somebody a second or maybe a third time at the Garden for the Big East tournament. I thought it was great. I entered that league and at that time, and you're interviewing John Thompson or Lou Carnesecca and Rolly Massimino, PJ Carlissimo. What a time. It was the players, but it was the coaches too. They had all these personalities. It was great. For a young beat writer at the time, it was absolutely fantastic. I'm covering, Derek Coleman and Billy Owens and Stevie Thompson and Sherman Douglas on the first team that I covered. Those names just rattle off the tongue, and you're like, wait, who? Those guys were all on the same team. Are you kidding? It was pretty amazing. It was a lot of fun, and those were some hard-fought basketball games back in those days, especially when the Big East made the mistake of going to 6 fouls for a while. It's like, I mean, geez, if you're going to allow guys to have 6 fouls, you might as back in those days, some of those Big East guys, you might as well just let them have boxing gloves or battle axes.
And, when you talk to, and as we have been fortunate enough on the 99 podcast to talk with guys from the Big East in the 1980s and 90s, and they talk about the physicality of the league, that it was Joe Comm, who was a walk-on at Syracuse back on the 87 team, he said it was hand-to-hand combat on the floor. He had never seen anything like it. Watching Patrick Ewing battle for post position. You mentioned earlier, though, at Madison Square Garden, the Big East tournament. What do you recall about your first experience at that environment? Because that is arguably the iconic, postseason basketball tournament until you get to March Madness, right?
Yeah.
And so what do you recall about maybe your first experience at the Big East tournament when you got to see all these teams, not just one or two, but now they're passing each other in hallways and they're watching each other's games, and the stakes are higher because there's a trophy at the end and a postseason berth. What do you recall maybe about the first experience there at the Big East tournament and what that dynamic was like? Can you tell people who've never been there? Can you say what that's like?
The buzz around the Garden, it's still there now, but even in those days, it was even more so. I mean, all these fans of different teams wearing their colors, their hats, their sweatshirts, and they're all around in those blocks around the Garden, and there's just such a vibe going on outside. All these bars all over the area. The Blarney Rock, I think it's gone now, was the Syracuse mainstay bar there, just a block or two away from the Garden. Stout and all these other places, Mustang Sally's or whatever is down the street, and a place called Local was kind of the writers' hangout. And I never seen anything quite like that, because there's nothing quite like the Garden right in the middle of New York City. And I'm sure we'll talk about some other Big East tournament experiences. But, the other thing, too, is the Garden. And, fans and the writers generally don't get to do this. But the teams get brought up in these big freight elevators inside the Garden. Because you remember, Garden hosts everything from dog shows to the Barnum and Bailey Circus to all these things. And so they have these big, huge freight elevators. And they're the kind where the bars shut across and come down. And it's like, you see like freshmen on different teams getting in these things, and their eyes are wide because they don't know what in the heck's going on here. It's almost like something from a prison scene on a movie set or something. And those gates close, and then they rise up and they take the team up to the next level. All that stuff's really cool about the Garden. And then, the Garden itself, when you get in that arena, you got all the fans from the different schools that are, all there in their sections, and the bands are there, and there's something really cool about the Garden. It's what I really miss about Syracuse's move from the Big East to the ACC is the Garden, especially at Big East tournament time.
And we're going to talk a little about that move to the ACC, but I want to stick on the Big East for just a little bit longer, and I want to talk about because they do make this move to the ACC in 2013. But you have, about, let's do our quick math, 15 years or so, 15 seasons or so. Oh, no, 25 seasons, I'm sorry, of covering
Don't shortchange me on trips to the Garden now.
Syracuse in the Big East. What was your favorite part of covering Big East basketball?
The whole thing, or just the tournament?
The whole thing. I mean, just covering Syracuse for that, 2.5 decades in the Big East.
Probably going back to the familiarity of it and the long-standing rivalries. Syracuse doesn't really have that kind of rivalry with anybody in the ACC right now. And everyone gets excited when Duke comes to town. That's obvious, but it's more of a happening than a renewal of a rivalry. The Big East, you saw everybody twice. And, for a few years, in the 90s there, players were still sticking around longer. So not only did you see teams twice every year, you saw that player 2, 3, sometimes 4 times, to the point where, man, you really hated Othello Harrington, or vice versa. I'm sure fans of other schools were really sick and tired of John Wallace before he finally left Syracuse. I like that. From a writer's perspective, I like the shorter road trips. I got to be honest. That's a purely selfish thing. I like being able to drive to Seton Hall, drive to Rutgers, get to the city easily. You may not be really aware of this, but, it's really hard to get from Syracuse, New York to Tallahassee, Florida.
Imagine.
I should write for a travel magazine for like business guys on, sales trips or something, not for the elite traveler. I need to write for some, outpost that has to try to get from Syracuse to Blacksburg, Virginia in a timely fashion, and in the winter. I always remind people my travel is during the one time a year where you really don't want to rely on weather to get from one place to another. But the Big East was really an incredible thing, an incredible phenomenon. And, I like seeing the fact that, people really were ready to write off the Big East when Syracuse and Pittsburgh and Boston College left, Louisville left, and Notre Dame left. And I'm glad to see that the Big East did survive and is now thriving. That's a great thing. And, the move to the ACC might have been a good thing and an understandable thing for all the schools that did leave the Big East. But I'm glad we still do have the Big East around, even if it is a little weird to see Creighton in the league.
No question. I wanted to stick on the Big East just for a pinch longer, because you mentioned some of the great personalities in that conference. I'm curious about what coach or what player, one of these iconic figures in the Big East that you maybe had a really soft spot for, or you were really scared of, or you had an interaction with that you will never forget. What kind of comes to mind, whether it's John Thompson or Louis or, maybe Othello Harrington, just what comes to mind when you think of Big East basketball? Like, I'm never going to forget this guy. That's for sure.
Oh, PJ Carlissimo was great. He was fun to talk to. He was a great interview. You could get him back on the phone if you called and requested him. And the great thing is, PJ, will still pick up the phone today if he sees my name pop up. I love PJ. Was absolutely fantastic. As a kid who spent most of his childhood in the South, I couldn't understand Lou Carnesecca, but I loved listening to him. He was so funny. Listen, when you're young and the first time you try to ask a question to John Thompson, it's always a little bit of a scary moment. And I remember the first post-game press conference with him, and I am trying to get the words out just right, and I'm kind of stumbling over it. I don't really phrase the question quite right. And he looks at me and he says, in that booming bass voice of his, "Are you trying to tell me how to coach my team?" No, no, I'm fine. And, the funny thing is, I don't know if it was after that game, but I think it was a few years down the road. There was another Syracuse-Georgetown game. But back in those days, Syracuse-Georgetown games would attract writers from other outlets, not just DC and Syracuse. The Boston Globe would send somebody. The Hartford Courant would send somebody. Everybody else, Philadelphia sent people to cover Syracuse-Georgetown. And I had a friend in the business, still a friend, Kenny Davis, was with the Hartford Courant, who did the best John Thompson imitation you've ever heard. And he snuck up behind me in the post-game press room, and I forget exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of, "Waters, you trying to, tell me how to coach my team?" And I didn't know it was Kenny. I thought it was John Thompson had come back in the press room looking for trouble. The guy that we don't talk about with the big Rick Barnes was great. He was an up and coming coach at the time. I think he'd been at George Mason. I don't know where else he had kind of cut his teeth before getting the Providence job.
Yeah.
So he was kind of a new, younger guy with all these big name coaches there. And I was young and probably about 24 or 25 years old and shaving about once a week at that point in my life. I hit puberty late. And so I looked younger than I was, and I was young anyway. And Rick Barnes dubbed me Doogie for Doogie Howser from that TV show back in the day with the young physician. And, I haven't seen Rick in many, many years, but he insists on still trying to call me Doogie, even though the hair is gray now. So that was kind of cool. Rick was a really great guy. And man, I don't know. Rolly Massimino didn't like the media too much, and especially print reporters, especially ones he didn't really know. And I remember one time Villanova got sent up here for the NCAA tournament, and I happened to know a friend who was kind of like a site organizer, and the next site was going to be the Meadowlands, and that's where this guy worked. And so he had come to Syracuse to take whichever teams won and kind of grab them right away and go over, okay, when you come back down to New Jersey for the Sweet 16 next week, we're going to have this, and this ready for you. And so he's in town. And so I go to dinner with him at this really nice restaurant, and the Villanova team is rolling in. Rolly knows this guy from years back. He's been a college administrator, and Rolly loves this guy. His name was Les Unger, and his son Mike and I were great friends. And Mike now works with USA Swimming, by the way. But so Rolly sees Les and and it's the Louis you used to see on TV. Hey, it's Louis Rolly Massimino. Always reminded me of Louis from Taxi. And then Les wants to introduce Rolly to me. And as he turns and says, "This is Mike Waters from the Syracuse Post-Standard," Rolly, his face goes from like this to, and he's like, the hand barely comes out. It's like, yep, that's the way Rolly thinks of print reporters, especially me. I don't know whether I had made an impression with him. But,
imagine what Rolly would think of bloggers today.
God, he'd hate the heck out of them. But it was
the aggregators.
All the personalities were amazing. The coaches back in those days of the Big East. And there's a book out. Dana O'Neill from The Athletic has a book out on the Big East, and she goes into all of their personalities and does a great job with it. And it was absolutely, when she did all that stuff for the book, she was dead on in what really drove the Big East. It was the players, Patrick Ewing, Pearl Washington, Chris Mullen, and then into the 90s, Allen Iverson, John Wallace, Donyell Marshall, all these guys. But man, the coaches that, they really just drove the league. It was an amazing time.
That's awesome. So we talk about the 90s. I want to jump into the 21st century. The real pinnacle of Syracuse hoops comes in 2003 when Carmelo Anthony leads the Orange to the program's first national title. So when you look back on that championship season, what moment sticks out to you?
I think it was a road trip to Michigan State.
We've talked about this on the program before with a guy named Jason Andreas, who was a Michigan State player at that moment. Yeah.
Well, apologies.
At Michigan State. Syracuse goes to Michigan State. As Jason tells a story, says,
yes,
we get all this hype around Carmelo. We're like, he's a freshman. He's going to come in here. We're going to show him what Big Ten basketball is all about. And Jason says, man, he took it to us. So tell me about that game from your perspective then.
It was a rare non-conference game, kind of late, in the season. And, so here's Syracuse going up to the Breslin Center, and Michigan State had a really good team. And listen, teams don't roll into the Breslin Center and get out with a win. And certainly non-conference teams don't get up there. So.
And certainly not against, an Izzo coach team that's going to hit the boards and going to be physical with you. Yeah.
And, Jason there is right, though. Carmelo was awesome. Now, I remember Michigan State had a kid named Chris Hill who made about 7 threes, I want to say. I mean, he was on fire. Not like Syracuse went in there and totally surprised the Michigan State team, caught them napping and got out with a win, stole a win. No, this was 2 teams that went at it, and basically they both had their best games that day. And when Syracuse won that game on the road, that was the first time I thought this team's going to be tough in March. I didn't say they were going to win at all, but I was like, if they can win on the road, not just win at home. And by the way, that team in 2003 went 17-0 at home. So you didn't beat them there. But when they started going on the road and proving that they could beat teams like Michigan State, and I think they followed that up with road wins at Notre Dame and Georgetown. So now, like very late in the year, you're starting to tick off road wins. Man, that's telling me that a team that at the beginning of the year was super young, with Carmelo a freshman, Jerry McNamara a freshman, Craig Forth and Hakeem Warwick are sophomores. That's a really, really young team. They lost their opener to Memphis at the Garden that year. So that team was maturing very, very quickly. And that stands out during the season before we get to March. That was a couple games there where you're like, man, this team's coming together. They're going to be tough.
And, talk about, let's get to March with that team though. I mean, they roll off, those 6 wins. Iconic game against Kansas in the national title game with Hakeem Warwick's block, arguably one of the best defensive plays we've ever seen in championship game history. What do you recall about, the championship or the Final Four weekend or the championship game? What sticks out about that for you as a team, as an observer of everything that's happening over that weekend in Final Four?
Sure. Before we get to the Final Four, one thing that sticks out to me about that March run was the second round game against Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State game's in Boston, and Oklahoma State jumps on them quick, gets out to a double-digit lead early. And Jim Boeheim made a switch that he would use sometimes during the season, but this time he kind of did it out of desperation because he was down, and he sent in some of his subs. Billy Edelin, a guard, came in the game. Josh Pace, a wing, comes in the game. Jeremy McNeil, the backup center, but a great shot blocker, comes in the game. And Jim Boeheim puts on his full court press with these guys in the first half of the game. And they get back in it. And I think they're still down at half, but they've closed that gap. And that was pretty amazing because we talked about this as a young team. And here you are in the second round of the tournament, and you're just getting blitzed by Oklahoma State. I mean, Oklahoma State's just running past them. Syracuse gets back in that game, and I think that was amazing about that game. And this is where the legend of Jerry McNamara starts to grow. As Syracuse is, I think, down 1 or 2. They've got the ball, and Jerry comes around a screen on the baseline, and he gets elbowed right above the nose, in the forehead, and it opens up a gash. The referees don't see it right away, and he's got blood streaming down his face as he comes around from under the basket and comes out, catches the ball on the wing, and takes a 3-pointer, and he makes it. And he put Syracuse ahead. I think it was Syracuse's first lead since maybe very, very early in the game. And he has blood coming down his face. And you don't see this in basketball. It looked like, it was a boxer. He makes the 3, and then the referees see the blood, and they stop the game, and Jerry has to leave the game. They actually patch him up. When he comes back in, he's got this big bandage. I don't know how he could see around it. But that was the tough blue-collar kid from Scranton and the legend growing right there. That's like one of those plays that you're just like, man, did that really happen? Or was that in a movie? Because that's really stupid. In basketball, as soon as a guy starts bleeding, we blow the whistle and stop the game. But the referees didn't see it, and Jerry didn't stop, and he makes the shot. And then, they win there, and then they win 2 games in Albany. They beat a number 1 seed Oklahoma team handily in the Elite 8. I mean, Hollis Price was a little gimpy. I think that he had an ankle injury, but Oklahoma couldn't figure out the zone to save their lives. It was unbelievable. So now they're off to the Final Four. I remember having to play Texas. It's another 1 seed. Kansas is out there, another 1 seed, I think. And then Marquette with Dwayne Wade. And it was practice in the week leading up to leaving for the Final Four, and I'm at Manley Fieldhouse. And I asked one of the Syracuse assistants, Troy Weaver. He's now the general manager of the Detroit Pistons. I asked him, how you feeling? He goes, I feel really good. I said, Texas is really good, man. They run. They're crazy. TJ Ford, they're nonstop. He goes, if we get back on defense and don't give them any fast break points, we're going to win. I was flat out. That's what Troy said. If we get back on defense, we're going to win. Like, wow. Okay, he was pretty confident. I think they allowed 2 fast break points. It's unbelievable how it was a high-scoring game, but I don't know how many times Texas actually had an open fast break. Syracuse they got back on defense every single time and made Texas score on them. And like I said, the game was high scoring, but and of course in that game you also have the Hakeem Warwick dunk over Royal Ivy. May he rest in peace. There's a nickname for it up here in the Syracuse area. I don't know if we're even allowed to say it on the podcast. Syracuse fans know what I'm talking about. That was an iconic play. And then the Kansas game, my guy, it starts off. Kansas had seen what Texas did. Texas thought they could guard Carmelo with a single guy.
Yeah.
And Carmelo went nuts. Carmelo had like 30 points and, 10 or 12 rebounds. It was just his best game of the entire season. He saved it for the Final Four against Texas because Texas thought they could man up and not give help or, whatever. Kansas saw that and they were going to help. They shaded towards Carmelo right away, and Jerry McNamara makes them pay. He hit 6 3-pointers in the first half of that game and staked Syracuse to a huge lead. And then I remember in the second half where I've got this lead written and I'm writing all this wonderful copy and Kansas is clawing its way back in, and you get that moment. Every sports writer knows this feeling when you're about to delete everything you've written because everything you're writing is based on Syracuse having won, and they've exorcised the ghost of 1987 in New Orleans because 03 was in New Orleans as well. Correct. And you've got all these former greats are in the stands there that day. Derek's there, Howard Trish is there, Ronnie Cycle's there, and all this stuff. And Kansas is about to come back and beat them, and I'm like, I'm going to delete all this stuff, but they held on. And you mentioned the Hakeem Warwick block. Holy cow. That was right down near the corner where I was. I still don't know how he got there. It's just, he defied physics to get from the paint. That was the other thing too. Jim Boeheim made it a really smart substitution right before Kansas had that final play. When Syracuse had a player at the free throw line, he took Craig Forth out of the game because he wanted a more mobile, guys out there. And he had Hakeem Warwick, a power forward, play center on that last possession. And Hakeem got to the corner and blocked that 3-pointer by Michael Lee. And it was one of those shots where it's like, I'm sure Michael Lee never thought in the world, there was any chance he was getting that shot blocked when he went out for it.
And, by this time you've covered Boeheim in the Syracuse program for about 15 years.
Yeah.
Did you see a different Jim Boeheim after that game? Or is he kind of even keel?
I think a little bit of a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I think that happens to every coach who's been around a significant amount of time and hasn't won that national title.
And you're knocking on the door for.
Yeah, he was. He had been to a Final Four in 87. He had been to a Final Four in 96. He had other teams like the 89 team that was really good, that got to the Elite Eight and lost to an Illinois team that was just as loaded as Syracuse was. He had some good teams and hadn't quite got there, and people, questioned his coaching and this and that. And, other coaches have gone through it too and will, but so when you win that one, that's one less thing people can criticize you for, right? Is that you haven't won it all. And, now he's been back several times since, but there's been other Final Fours, 2013, 2016, unexpected runs. So I think now as he's well respected as a coach. He had that lifted from his shoulders, but I don't know how much he's really changed. He's a very strong personality. He's very strong in his beliefs. He makes a coaching move. He totally believes that's the right move. And that's it. That's the right move. He's thought it through. He will challenge you as a reporter.
You can't tell him how to coach his team.
I don't. We don't bother with that. I've learned how to phrase the questions better than that first time with John Thompson.
That's good. If we were to create a family feud style game here, and you were to assemble 100, just seasoned college basketball fans and said, hey, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Syracuse hoops? I think we're going to get a lot of that 2003 team, a lot of Carmelo, maybe a Lawrence Moden or a Sherman Douglas or a Pearl or a Jim Boeheim Big East. But a number of folks, their idea is going to go to one of the most iconic college basketball games ever, and that's the 6 overtime game in the Big East tournament between Syracuse and UConn. And I still have this game on my DVR, actually, because my little boy watches it all the time. So take us back to that night, March 12th, 2009, at Madison Square Garden. Paint the picture. What memories are with you and aren't going away about that just remarkable game there in the Garden that night?
Well, the neat thing is you start with a couple things that it's Syracuse and UConn. There's 2 standard bearer programs for the Big East for much of the last 2 decades. Connecticut's won, Jim Calhoun has won his national title. Syracuse has a national title to its name. Both coaches are in the Hall of Fame already. So it's those 2, and they're both ranked. And Syracuse was number 20 in the country. I think Connecticut was top 5, maybe 4th. They're ranked, and this is a quarterfinal game. In a lot of other places, this is like the conference championship game, and instead it's a quarterfinal. And the other thing, and this is just pure luck, it's the last game of the quarterfinals. All the other 3 games are all over and done with. And so now this is the last game. So when these 2 teams start going at it, it's late. Fans are lubricated. It's Connecticut and Syracuse. It's the 2 biggest fan bases that ever go to the Big East tournament. So the Garden's packed. Connecticut fans and Syracuse fans have bought up every ticket for anybody who was willing to give theirs away. If there was a St. John's or Seton Hall fan that didn't want to go to the game, they could get rid of the ticket. It was sold out. So they're all there, and then it starts percolating. That as we start going on into the night and we start going overtime after overtime, it was kind of neat that it was the last game of the day. So because now we're all focused on this, and it's not like we're at 2:30 start in the afternoon, and we're going to like a first or second or third overtime at about 5. It was something different about being there at midnight, getting ready for the next overtime. They're able to, the Garden PA people are geniuses. They're playing, after midnight, in the breaks, between all that stuff. And, fans are actually having to make very important choices as the night's going on. They're checking the train schedules to see when the last train to Jersey or Long Island or wherever is leaving, because Penn Station's right underneath the Garden. So it's not like if you were in Greensboro for the ACC tournament or Indianapolis for the Big Ten tournament, fans aren't having to make a conscious decision on whether to leave or stay based on, I'm going to be stranded in Manhattan. I can't get to Jersey if this goes another overtime. We're in trouble. And then the guy sitting next to him says, we'll get a hotel room. Forget it, because if you're in Indianapolis, you're walking to your hotel or you're getting in your car and you're driving. Same with Greensboro, the ACC. I tell you what, and they're making – people know. All those fans, I can't remember whether they actually made announcements or not, but I think they did. Like last train, Jersey, leaving at whatever, 12:31, and very few people left. That was what was so cool. It's like people are like, screw it. We're in. We're staying. It's Connecticut, Syracuse, and we're going to a 5th overtime now. And we'll figure out how to get to Metuchen, or someplace out on Long Island. We'll figure that out later. And because we're not missing the rest of this. And that we're not even talking about the game, what happened on the court. It's what happened around the court. I don't remember the fans sitting down once the overtime started. Everyone's on their feet. It's like the players, coaches, and especially the fans, I think, sense the growing magnitude of the event as we went from one overtime to the next, to the next, to the next. They knew. Everyone knew. Even the referees are kind of giving looks to each other as we go to a 4th overtime. I mean, those guys knew it. It's like, this is really special. We're really experiencing history by the time we get to the 5th and then 6th overtime.
Absolutely. If only Eric Devendorf was just a pinch quicker on the release.
Well, writers would have made their deadlines. That would have been great. But we would have been robbed of a 6 overtime game that we talk about to this day. I mean, Eric's shot was amazing. I mean, I think Syracuse, Paul Harris took the ball out of bounds with like 1.7. I don't know if he even had that. I can't remember the time on the clock. But he throws the ball 3/4 the length of the court. I think Gavin Edwards might have gone off his fingertips. And then Eric grabs it there and goes up. Yeah, man, if he had just done his nails that morning, that shot's good. Syracuse wins. We all right, and we go home or out into the streets. But instead, we're there for
So let me ask you this from take us behind the curtain. A little inside baseball here on the journalistic side, but your paper has X amount of space devoted to, hey, Mike's game story on Syracuse UConn. I mean, you're not getting what happens. What happens? Did that game story make it in? I mean, how do you fill this void in the newspaper? What were those, you and your editor, how'd you attack that?
Like most papers, we had several deadlines throughout the night. So like the early deadlines are the papers that go to the outlying counties. So they don't have a Syracuse game result in there. They've got the results of the West Virginia game or, and a note in there. The Syracuse Connecticut game ended after our deadlines. Please go to syracuse.com for full coverage. And we knew that was going to happen for our early deadlines because Syracuse is playing in the last quarterfinal game of the night, and they say it's going to start at 9. It never does. It's going to start at 9:20, if we're lucky, 9:30, whatever. So it did. I think it started in that range of like 9:25, 9:30, something like that. So we know we're not making our earliest deadlines. So we're prepared for that. But then we were really hoping we would hit our midnight deadline. That didn't happen.
No.
And then we start, and then I'm calling my boss in between and when's the next deadline? 12:15. They're going to a second overtime. When's the next deadline? And then, they go to a third overtime. Okay, when's the next deadline? And so we're bumping it back every time. And I'm writing copy, filler, just back, game play-by-play stuff that is really, really important at the time that you're writing it. The play at the end of the first overtime, Johnny Flynn dishing to Rick Jackson for the dunk that ties it up. And then by the time you're to the third or fourth overtime, you're like, that Johnny Flynn to Rick Jackson thing, meaningless at this point because so many other things have happened and you're writing it. And our drop dead deadline to get anything into any of our papers was 1:30 in the morning. And the game ended, I believe, at like 1:22 a.m. or 1:22 or 1:24 in the morning. And because I had written some other stuff and we just popped a lead on there, and I benefited greatly. That game's tight. Obviously, it's going all these overtimes. The sixth overtime, Syracuse opened up a big lead early on.
And really take some control of the game. You're right.
They did. And so they're up by like 10. They end up winning by 10. And the last minute and a half, there was a foul or two. There was a whistle. And that gives a sports writer a chance to write another paragraph. Another paragraph. We can get some stuff in there. And so I was able to send a story that did get into the paper the next day. And that's like one of the crowning achievements on my journalistic career.
Well, thanks for pulling back the curtain on that one. As a fellow journalist, I think it's kind of cool to hear that. So we've talked a lot about the Big East. I just want to kind of go in a slightly different direction. As I said, Syracuse leaves the Big East in 2013. They join the ACC. Just kind of from a high level, how has this move impacted Syracuse basketball? How do you think it's going to be changing the dynamic around the program or what it means to follow Syracuse? Or how's it made it just a little bit different than the first, 20-some years of your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's different. Fans, Syracuse's fan base is largely Northeast. They live in New York City. They live in Washington, D.C. or up and down the Eastern Seaboard there from D.C. to Boston, largely. I mean, there's pockets in Atlanta or other places like every school. But, whereas like you used to go to a Syracuse Providence game and see a whole lot of Syracuse fans or a Syracuse Seton Hall game and see a whole lot of Syracuse fans. It's like you go to Syracuse, Florida State, it's you don't see them. It's harder for Syracuse fans to get there. And there's fewer Syracuse fans that live there that get the chance to see their team that one time out of the season when they come down. Now, you get some of the folks in the Carolina area, but they can't get into Cameron Indoor. There's no available tickets and, stuff like that. So, there's a little bit of a loss in terms of there's that, you don't have that rivalry with anybody anymore. Syracuse fans get real excited about Duke, but it's kind of like when Maryland was in the ACC, they always wanted Duke to be their rival. And Duke's like, yeah, we're kind of busy with these Tar Heels down the road. They're a little bit closer to us than the Maryland folks. So it's not a rivalry unless both people agree on it. So I wrote about the move to the ACC recently and how it's affected the Syracuse basketball program. It's been a little tougher. Their regular season in conference record is not what it was when they were in the last 7-8 years of the Big East. It's been a little bit of a struggle. There's been a lot of other factors besides just the move. I mean, the program was hurt by the timing. When they moved to the ACC, they're actually under an NCAA investigation at the time. That's going to hurt recruiting, and that's not exactly when you also want to be changing leagues and have these other things happening. There was questions about Jim Boeheim and would he retire. Actually, after the 2015 season, which was just Syracuse's second year in the ACC, when the NCAA sanctions were announced, and those sanctions are going to hurt recruiting for the next few years. The cloud of the investigation hurts, and then the sanctions hurt. But at least the investigation's over and you know what you're dealing with. But Jim Boeheim, after the 2015 season, says he's going to leave in 3 years. And Mike Hopkins will take over after the 2018 season. And I talked with Jim about it recently. And in addition to the move to the ACC, which a lot of folks think has hurt Syracuse in terms of losing a little bit of their recruiting base. But, Jim Boeheim told me that he really thinks that 3 years there when people knew for sure he was leaving and when, also hurt recruiting. He really emphasized that in an interview with me. I thought that was interesting because I always thought all along, as when people were going to start asking when he's going to retire, that it would help recruiting being able to say, well, the next coach is sitting right here. It's associate head coach Mike Hopkins. He's the heir apparent. He's recruiting you too. So the guy coaching you is sitting here in front of you, me and him. That was the way it was kind of pitched at the time, that it was going to help. But I don't know whether it's a little bit of revisionist history or we're just kind of looking at things differently after the fact. But Jim thought it actually hurt. So now you don't see Jim saying when he's going to retire, just that he's coaching this season. And he also has said he's coaching next year too. So, so you lose some of that. Personally, I had to find out where all the media parking lots were and where the media doors were. I got lost a lot that first year. I walked around a lot of arenas looking for that door that, where in the Big East, I knew exactly where the door was to get in, where the credentials were being handed out. So I had to learn where to eat, where to grab a beer after a game.
All that good stuff. Better weather, at least.
Some better weather. But you know what? It's really hard to cover the last quarterfinal game of the ACC tournament and finish your story and go find a place that will sell you a beer after midnight on a Thursday in Greensboro. Whereas after the 6 overtime game at the Garden, I left the Garden at 4:30 in the morning, walked out into the New York City streets. I had plenty of options.
A little different, no question. Mike, so you've seen, over 1,000 games over, Syracuse games over the last 3 decades. And we've talked about some really rich memories here that you have of that. So I just want to dig into that a little bit more, reflect with some quick little hit style things. So what particular Syracuse team did you most enjoy covering?
Well, I think a lot of people would expect me to say 2003, which was national championship. And yeah, that was really kind of fun to cover a team that we actually ended a season with a happy locker room. Every year the locker room at the end of the season is always sad because you lose your last game. You almost always lose your last game. But I tell you what, 2010, the 2010 team was really a good group of players. They were a little older. You had guys like Andy Routens and Arenzi Anawaku were both fifth-year seniors. Wes Johnson had transferred in from Iowa State and was an All-American. Brandon Trish was a local kid and started as a freshman on that team. They were unranked at the start of the season. And at one point later in the year, they're number 1 in the country. And they had a number 1 seed in the tournament, but Arenze Anawaku had injured his knee in the Big East tournament in a game against Georgetown. And he would not be able to play in the NCAA tournament. And without that 5th-year starting center, you're still okay. They won 2 games in the NCAA tournament. They were good enough to do that. But they weren't, without Arenze, they weren't good enough to go any further. They ran into a Cinderella Butler team that maybe wasn't so much of a Cinderella as this. We just didn't really know how good they were.
Yeah.
And they did have 2 NBA guys on their roster. But that 2010 team, I really enjoyed covering that team. I think it was because, they went from unranked to number 1, and you had local kids like Brandon Trish and Andy Routens, on the roster. And so that was a really cool team. And I'll never forget that locker room. We talk about sad locker rooms. Oh my God. There was a bathroom stall in Salt Lake City that Andy Routens destroyed. I'm pretty sure it was Andy. We weren't totally sure. We heard the destruction taking place. I remember Arenze Anawaku sitting in his locker. Remember, he didn't even play. He's out. He's got the knee injury. But his career was over at that point. And he's sitting in his locker, and he had a towel draped down in front of him that was hung from the top. So he was just kind of hiding from everybody. And he's in tears behind the towel. That was a very distraught locker room.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hard things to see sometimes when these college careers end.
Yes.
We talked a little about, so you had a great time covering that 2010 team. I want to stick on this note a little bit, because journalists are, of course, taught to leave their fandom behind, park it on the side. But what particular Cuse player, especially as you kind of reflect now, what particular Cuse player did you have maybe a soft spot for, or find yourself rooting for a little bit?
You're right. I mean, as journalists, we don't cheer. There's no cheering in the press box. We root for good stories. It's what we do. We root for good stories, and we root to beat deadlines. We root against overtime all the time. Let's hurry this up. But some kids you get to know a little bit more because they've been around in the program for 4 or 5 years, and you've seen them go from 18-year-old kid to 22 or 23-year-old, and it's a little different. They really do know you a little bit. They get your questioning. I mentioned Andy Routens earlier. He was a local kid. He was a very unheralded recruit. A lot of folks thought Jim Boeheim just gave him a scholarship because he was Leo's dad, right?
Leo's kid, yeah.
Yeah, he was Leo Routens' Leo Routens' kid. Oh, that's the only reason Jim Boeheim. It's a legacy thing, Who else recruited Andy? It was like Siena and Providence or whatever. And how good can he be?
Ask UConn how good he was in that 6 overtime game.
Yeah, he hit that 3 at the end of the 3rd overtime that was clutch. But he had a lot of shots. And, I know Andy's dad, Leo. I didn't cover Leo, but Leo and I are close to the same age. So it's like when I do end up meeting Leo and talking to him for a lot of stories over the years, well, we're the same age, and I, having not covered him, it was a little different. And then I get to know his kid, Andy. So Andy sticks out, but there's been a lot of kids. Scoop Jardine was a kid that I get everybody that covered him liked him. He was a great outgoing personality, funny, and if you knew where he came from and some tough area of Philadelphia there, not easy. And you would have thought he had grown up on the beaches of Southern California, sunniest attitude, nothing seemed to get Scoop down. Scoop was funny and engaging and great quote. So I've been fortunate. I've covered a lot of guys that were a pleasure to cover. I'll say it that way. Instead of saying like I rooted for anybody or I had a soft spot.
That's cool.
There was a lot of guys that were really just a pleasure to cover. And the nice thing is you mentioned my podcast earlier, is I'm tapping back into those guys. And I'm getting some of these guys on the podcast, and now it's completely different. Like instead of covering, asking Terrence Roberts questions when he's like 18, 19 years old, I'm now talking to a 40-year-old Terrence Roberts, and our relationship's at a completely different level now. It's like I can ask him questions about stuff that happened then that maybe you couldn't at the time, or you get a totally different answer. It's a lot of fun.
I also want to ask about your favorite Coach Boeheim story over 30 years.
There's we've had our share of run-ins. That's probably what you're expecting, right? You want to hear the writer run-in with Jim. I mean, there's a few, and
maybe it's something touching. Maybe he sent you, cookies one Christmas or something. Who knows?
Julie made him buy me and my wife dinner when they saw us at a restaurant one time. So I don't know if it was
Julie made him buy you guys dinner.
Julie and Jim. My wife and I are out for our anniversary at a nice restaurant. The kind of restaurant that sports writers only go to on special occasions. And we're sitting there, and we're having a very nice, lovely dinner. And the Boeheims start to, I think actually one of the kids walked in first. Hi, buddy. How you doing? Whoever come, and then Jim and Julie. And so we said hello. And then my wife and I are enjoying our dinner. And at the end of the night, our waiter comes over and says, you're all set. I had my credit card out, ready to go, and turns out Julie had tried to pick up the check without me knowing about it. And, I'm never supposed to happen. You're not supposed to do that. I went over protesting, no, you're not supposed to. And Jim says, I told you he wouldn't want you to do that. It's like, and she said, no, it was your anniversary and whatever. So, that was interesting. That was more of a Julie moment than a Jim moment, right?
All right, well, we won't have the journalism police come and lock you up, okay?
Thank you. But he and I have had run-ins since then. Nothing has changed. We have had our arguments. Jim's got a big reputation, and it's founded on solid evidence. There's a reputation there. A lot of people have seen it in post-game news conferences when he's gone after a reporter, challenged a reporter. Of course, the famous Jerry McNamara press conference in 2006 at the Big East tournament, when, the Jerry McNamara, we wouldn't have won 10 effing games, the tirade at the Big East press conference, where he dropped a couple F-bombs. And this was at the beginning when some places were starting to go live with the post-game press conferences. So, yeah, he's had those. And, but here's the thing about Jim Boeheim that a lot of people don't know. He's more press friendly than a lot of coaches out there who seem like really nice guys. His practices have been open for many years. I used to go to practices were open the entire practice. Now that's changed in recent years, and now it's like only the opening 20 minutes. But you can go every single day, and you now have to make phone calls and say, hey, I want to come. I'm going to pop in. Okay, fine. But, God, there were times when I went to practice and I didn't even want to go to practice, because back when we had 2 newspapers in town, I was always afraid that if I didn't go to practice, my competitor on the other newspaper would be there and something would happen and I'd get beat. So I had to go to practice. It's like a lot of reporters can't go to practice and they really wish they could go once in a while. I had to go because back when it was open and I had competition with another newspaper, I couldn't not go. His locker rooms are open post game. A lot of coaches close the locker room. I tell people all the time, closing your locker room stunts the growth of your kids as people, and it also stunts the growth of your team in terms of chemistry and working with it. And people are like, what do you mean chemistry? Coaches bring out 2 or 3 players to a post-game press conference. It's the leading scorer and whoever else they thought had a good game. Or they always bring the senior captain, the leaders, right? Well, just take like one of the Syracuse's one of their more recent games. Buddy Boeheim had 23 points and Joe Girard had a good game too. Those would be the 2 guys that were brought in. after that game, I wanted to write about Jesse Edwards, who's a new starter, younger kid, who had 4 block shots, scored handful of points, I think like 6 points, but I wanted to write about Jesse and his development and how he's going to be key for this team. I don't get to write that story if I'm covering a host of other colleges. But because Jim Boeheim has an open locker room, I get to go in there and I get to talk to Jesse. And I get to talk to Joe about Jesse, or I get to talk to somebody else about Jesse. It's not just the same 2 guys. And what also happens is like after a loss, we come into the locker room and I'm talking to maybe Buddy Boeheim or Jimmy Boeheim, or in past years, like back in like 1990, whenever, if I'm talking to a veteran on the team, a young Adrian Autry, a freshman, is watching that veteran after a loss stand there and answer questions, and learning from that. Oh, that's how you handle a loss, So having that post game, that locker room open is like, I think young kids learn from watching the veterans guys do, how they handle the media. I think also having a young kid who maybe gets interviewed every once in a while by maybe one guy off to the side helps that young kid learn how to do an interview. And then by the time he gets more people around him, he can handle it then. I think that's a team building thing. I think that adds to cohesion. I mean, I did a story on a walk-on after one of their exhibition games. You think all the other walk-ons didn't love the heck out of that story when they saw it? Because that was one of theirs, right? Mm-hmm. That was one of their guys who got in a game and made a shot. And I went and I interviewed him after the game. And, and not only did the walk-ons probably love it, the scholarship guys love it too, because scholarship guys all love the walk-ons. The walk-ons work with them all the time. They're together. They're a team. So I guarantee you, like, after when that story ran a couple weeks ago on a walk-on, I'm sure Buddy Boeheim loved it. Joe Girard loved it, because that's the guy that works with them in practice every single day. They like to see that guy rewarded. And it's funny, for a few years back, Roy Williams' locker room was open. Duke's locker room was open, at least at home. Rick Pitino had an open locker room. Izzo had an open locker room. Boeheim, open locker room. Sports is such a copycat thing. Coaches copy everything from everybody, right? I mean, if Tom Izzo came out tomorrow and started playing only 4 guys and put them in a diamond set, there'd be some guy at Western Michigan or a junior college in Michigan copying Izzo and only playing 4 guys. As stupid as it is, even he'd go 4-on-5 and people would copy it. But all these young coaches don't ever ask Jim Boeheim, is there a benefit to you opening up your locker room? What would it be? And because all these Hall of Fame national championship winning coaches had this, and then all these other guys close their locker rooms and keep the press at bay and stuff. I'll tell you something else too. At the NCAA tournament, the locker rooms are open. So having an open locker room during the course of your regular season will prepare your team for the environment that they're going to see at the tournament. And I'm hoping some sports information directors and coaches are listening. And I'm going to get off my soapbox now as a beat guy. Sorry,
I think we have a few fans. I think we have a few listeners from the athletic departments of the university. So hopefully that it can be the case.
That's my TED Talk. Thanks for
certainly
coming.
Some great SIDs out there and athletic department folks out there that can help out the media. But all right, we got our final question here for you. I teased it earlier. Your all-time Cuse starting 5, and let's just limit it to your coverage of the team from '89 to the present day. So let's just kind of go through.
Oh,
let's go traditional center, 2 forwards, 2 guards. All right, all-time Cuse starting 5,
and it's got to be guys I covered, so I can't put Roosevelt Bowie at center. Okay, I'd like to. This is really bad because there's going to be some guys mad at me. And so much for getting, so-and-so on my podcast next. Center that I covered is probably Etan Thomas.
Makes sense, yeah.
Still the school's all-time leading shot blocker by almost 100 blocks, which is insane to think of.
So he's going to anchor the back of that 2-3 zone.
No one is scoring inside of 10 feet against me. So
gotcha.
I got that going for me, which is nice. Power forward can be none other than, John Wallace is going to be really mad. but I got to go with Derek.
DC, number 1 draft pick. Listen, John Walls was a stud, but DC
He was.
People
And the
forget
thing
how
is,
great
they
DC
both would
was.
get mad. I mean, John is probably now looking for me, but yeah, a few years ago, Derek Coleman was a celebrity coach at a fantasy camp, and I got to do the camp as like a embedded reporter, and I got to play in the camp. And Derek, apparently remembering some slight during the days when he was at SU, that in my coverage, hopped into a drill right as I was my turn to come around a screen. They were working with us on like downs cuts and stuff, like a 40-year-old guy can execute a down cut. Anyway, he goes timeout, and he hops in, and I run it, and illegal screen can't even describe what he did to me. He hip checked me into the boards, to use a hockey phrase. I actually did come out of one Nike. The right shoe stayed on, the left shoe went flying. Derek Coleman, even then, so that's why Derek Coleman's my power forward, because I'm afraid of what he'd do to me now.
And then I would imagine we got to have Carmelo at the small forward.
Yeah, that's an easy one, right? I don't think anyone's going to get too mad at me.
All right, so then let's go to the guards. Syracuse has a great guard history. Who we putting on our all-time Syracuse starting 5?
This is where it was hard in the front court. Now it gets really hard. I mean, I got Jerry McNamara, and then I got Lawrence Moulton, and then I got Sherman. Now, I only covered Sherman for 1 year. I could use that as an out, right?
So maybe we stick it with Jerry.
I could go with Jerry and Lawrence. I could go with Jerry and Lawrence and beat a lot of people. But I tell you what, if I had an all-time team and like I didn't want to take a cheap way out, Sherman's my starting point guard. With all due respects to Pearl, Pearl was probably more important to this program than anybody. Arguably, maybe Melo because of the title, and maybe Dave Being early on. But Pearl's the most important guy to this program. But Sherman was the point guard. Makes sense.
Yeah. Every program has to have a point guard, and we mean point guard, capital P, capital G.
And he was the general. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Mike, it's been a rich look into Syracuse hoops, and we appreciate you joining us here on the 99 podcast. Thanks so much.
This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the 99 podcast. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, make sure you do. And while you're at it, leave us a rating or review. 5 stars only, like the basketball camp. We also have links to all of 99 social media so you never miss a release. Until next time.